again, welcome and many thanks for having me today. And I'm really looking forward to this session. Hope you will take quite a bit of things with you and learn something. Of course, there's always time for questions. I factored that time in. And without any further ado, let's get started for today. Here's just a reminder, about the quiz. We just heard it from Hansa Malila. Take it. It's really worth the effort. Get to many sessions as you can, and join us and win big. Win one of the 20 tickets, for example, for masterclass, which is really a great way to educate yourself, for example, with really great skills and cooking, for example. That seems to be one of the things that really sets them apart. So just from my perspective, my name is Martin Pitzing. I'm working at a IT company based in Vienna in Austria, and most of my time I'm actually working as a multi-cloud architect, like saying I'm advising customers in working together with Microsoft Azure and Amazon Web Services, and I'm actively trying to build up hybrid setups. And normally I wouldn't normally look in that direction, but I'm actually coming from a quite different setup when I started this journey. I started with Power BI in 2015 and have since worked my way around with PowerPlatform and everything that was connected to it. So data engineering is one of the things that I'm normally doing. And but Power BI, for example, and PowerPlatform, it's all of its components kind of like stayed with me in all of this time. So coming from that background, so what to expect from today's session? I'm gonna have like a wild guess and a really broad assumptions and saying, okay, from today's audience perspective, I expect people that have, of course, because we are in the developer track, to have a development background. But it's gonna be perfectly, of course, if you know both sides. But that doesn't like hinder us in the first place to get started. So meaning, I think there's gonna be some people that are really pros, really power users in PowerAutomate, PowerApps, everything that PowerPlatform offers. And there's going to be hopefully, of course, people that work with that, or are developers inside companies that work with Azure, or admins of Azure, sysadmin, Azure admin, classical ones. And I hope, and I do assume that you got Azure running for your company, for your organization, that you actively use these things. And of course, so you have a couple of resources already in place. You already put in the work. You already thought all of the process and the architectures through, everything that is already set up and everything that should work, and you already maintain it. And from this perspective, there's a lot of things that are already there. So why not? And how couldn't you like just give other people securely access to all of these things? And that would be aligning, of course, very neatly with PowerPlatform, where there's always as well like a couple of people. Most of the time, from my experience working with customers, most of the time mending and taking care of all of the environments and the setting up flows, for example, for people sharing the flows, or maybe like implementing them from code again and again and again. So maybe you look beyond that. I will assume that you are ready, for example, and you want to go further. You've tackled one of the issues from for example, flow, where you say, I can't do that action properly, for example, without like up licensing. I need more standalone licenses and everything. And look around. Maybe it's something that you could do around that, for example. So on a tech level, I'm going to have you covered today. I will be looking at the components. I will be looking at both sides. Will not take too much effort and will not go too deep, but have you understand what you could possibly do, showcase what we have, and see from that perspective to have you on board for both sides of this story. And so my goal for today would be for you to understand, first of all, the sessions, the services that we're using in the session. Then, of course, kind of like the methods, how to integrate with PowerPlatform. First, so there's going to be some there. And there's, of course, some patterns, how to do it. Then I will explain about the patterns and why I think these actually work well, and in what kind of like setups we already used it. Then I'm going to show you how these work in actions, for example, from both sides, like from the Azure perspective and from PowerPlatform, how you would, for example, be able to consume them. So quick recap of Power Platform is coming up. So I guess I catched a little bit up with my time, so that we have a bit more time at the end of the session. So for those people who are not quite familiar with Power Platform, it's just a short overview of how you would normally integrate with it. For example, there's this a lot, like over 300 connectors, which are like smart code snippets that are provided and managed by Microsoft, for example, that allow you to integrate with almost everything that is there in the Microsoft universe. And then beyond that, a lot of third-party integrations and a lot of other services that might be already in your organizations, where you as a user can use Power Platform to access these services and get data, for example, or interact with the services that way. Then, of course, there's Dataverse for those who are a little bit more into this topic, for example, and already have done spent some time with how to integrate with Dataverse as a backend system and use it as a data source for Power Platform. Then, of course, there's the Data Gateway, which is existing for on-premise purposes and Azure. And there is AI Builder, which is also a really great way to integrate other services from other components, like cognitive services from Azure, and the native integrations, of course, like with Teams. Team cards, for example, is one of the things, or Dynamics, if you have that one running up. And of course, there's custom connectors. So from this perspective, for example, we have to say PowerAutomate, for example, in this respect is really cool. It's got this really low barrier to entry, and you can really start using a lot of data and do a lot of automations for yourself, for example, to get your productivity up, to have like these small processes automated, to have those recurring stuff automated, like really on a low scale, and you can really easily integrate with that one. This is all coming from there, and you can go from there and build more complex solutions. You can even build like business critical flows where you involve people for approval processes and then work your way with workflow actions to enter data, performing data alterations, and maybe bringing it back to PowerApps, for example, and to have users work with that as well of this whole service. So that works really well from that perspective here. So, but coming from that one, for example, what I'm normally facing there, was the thing that is always coming in place when we are talking about like this kind of services from a development perspective is like, this is low code, and often you hear like people saying this is not software development. It's what else? What else can you offer? Like, where's the coding part? And as you can see with the components from Hans Maliga, it was really easy, for example, to have regex put into and just reuse everything that you already have, for example, and just put it into a code view. That works well with Power Platform. So, and there's of course always this broad feature of palette, for example, where you can just go to the next data source, see what else can do. How do you integrate that one? Maybe it helps you in your daily work, and maybe it offers you like some combining actions, for example, where you don't have to have like a structured database in place just to perform like some simple joins for this one. Yeah. So we got a whole lot of custom connectors here, and this is just what I wanted to show you. How would it look like? So give me a second to just switch over to my demo. By the way, we're going to do that quite often today. For example, just to give you a little bit more insight into that one. But it would have helped, for example, if it would have let me just pick easily is the right one. Yeah. So you might be familiar with this kind of view, for example. So this is a PowerApps platform here. I'm actually looking at PowerApps right now because my trial was expiring for PowerAutomate. So we're going to use the PowerApps platform, PowerApps user interface today instead of PowerAutomate, but it's essentially the same. So as you see under the data part, there's connections. So if you look for Azure, there you see a lot of Azure connectors readily available for you to see, and when you look closely, you might see that one most of them are actually labeled with a premium feature, and I can use them because I have like an upsell license, a standalone license, a user plan here. So for me, it's not a big deal to work with these, but it might not be feasible for everyone to use premium features because it is kind of like really expensive. Like looking at for example, my geography, where we'd have to pay like $40 per person extra on top to the M365 subscriptions, just to have them in the same level so they can use what we already built. And if you have that for small scale applications, small scale company, it's something to think about how you could do it differently. That's my thinking here, for example, because I really like to just take things and try to optimize them and have them, like, let's say, boil down to a point where you just like have a lot of shortcuts already in place, and you can be. Well, I'm proud of this one. If it works, I really like this one. And of course, I'm always looking at like how could you save costs for customers? How can you just break it down into smaller pieces and have, for example, repeatable components in place where you don't have to have like a full licensing. So it's just the right amount of money for the right amount of services. So that might be something you would be familiar with. So once again, just 1 second. So back on the line. So what's now seen? It's the wrong one. It's my transcript, all right? That is not something that you need to see. But let's go back to this one and it'll work. Anyways, so as you talked about, there's types of connectors, there's context and usage, there's this part with the administration of supervision, for example, of data flows. So you might want to know if you're, for example, a global admin or like you're a Power Platform admin, you might want to know what people are doing with the data, who's using it, and you might be like separating, also thinking about like using different ways to integrate, for example, or keep apart different data sources, different flows, and need different environments for that. And that for that you might need to, of course, to have the right admin privileges in place, for example. Meaning like it could be becoming complex. And of course, it helps if, for example, if you don't introduce another level of more complexity here, but you could separate them out a bit, for example. So that's what I want to know, to talk about, like what's important now in Power Platform. It's really focused on individual productivity. So if you're an individual who has access to different kind of like business solutions, perfect. That's the way forward. It really works well with that. You use what you have been given through your identity, through your roles and rights, for example. But from a top-down perspective, looking at the administration part that comes up, there is quite a bit of complexity here to get everything working together and be sure that everything works the way it's intended to be used. And for certain use cases, that makes, of course, sense to just stay with the PowerAutomate, for example. But for normally, let's say, for example, if you're looking at two complex solutions, for example, it might be worth to look at, for example, the Microsoft components that is already open with the Center of Excellence kit. That would allow you to just like have a bunch of automatically managed solution parts that Microsoft offers to have a data collection inside every environment, working together into already set up dashboards and for example, like model-based apps that allow you to just like with a click of that one to have a complete overview integrated with log and monitoring solutions, for example, in M365, to just like know what is happening, to see what kind of like data sources are being used, for example, and to act, for example, with data loss prevention policies to steer a bit what is happening on the platform. So this is the kind of like complexity. So there's best practices just for you to remember. These exist and they do exist for a reason, and it makes sense to have them in place if you're looking at more complex ways to integrate. So for starters, PowerAutomate is great. So now I'm gonna switch over to the Azure part. And for this, let's have a direct look at LogicApps and PowerAutomate, for example. Meaning, let's look at them from left to right and look, for example, like, because most of you might be familiar with LogicApps as well. It kind of looks like the same. And I wanted to show you where they differ and why they differ and why it makes sense that they should differ, for example. So for this, I'm gonna be sharing my whole screen. So don't be afraid if you don't see any, if you can't read it anymore, I'll be zooming in soon, shortly. Don't worry. Just to have them next to each other, you know, this one, and of course, that one here. It's not the one I want to look at. We're gonna see the same one here, for example. This one's in place from a run perspective, and the same is going to be here, for example, if it loads. So I hope you can read it all. I'm just gonna zoom in more. So come on. My mouse is stuck. I'm sorry. I have to zoom out a bit. So as you can see, like the interface does look a lot like the same on both sides. And so this one works. So you can see, for example, I can say the same structure I can see on the LogicApps, for example, where this one is just intended to query SQLDB, get some info out and put it into a storage account and send a response back. And as you can see, for example, I'm integrating with a lot of services from left to right. I have the integrations from both sides where I can use, for example, Key Vault to store my user credentials, Key Vault to store access keys, for example. And of course, I have all of the connectors with SQL Server. This one is just a sample SQLDB that I just like set up for just sample query parts. And as you can see, for example, it looks the same on both sides. The difference actually exists, of course, and one of the major differences that we have, for example, is if you look at, for example, the user interface, for example, you see different run histories quasi, but you can't really see, for example, like the depth of it. For example, I see, for example, I had a typo in there. It always tells me that every couple of them failed because I was like misspelling a header variable. And as you can see, I see a lot more information, for example, about this one. So this is one of the major things. I can like re-roll roles. I can see what has happened over the time, and I can drill deep into. And of course, I can integrate it with monitoring, for example, through alerts or through medics. And with Azure Monitor, I can do a bit more than the integration with M365 because that works and it's possible, but it's not the same quality. Next thing that is really nice, and I do use that quite often, is the Logic App code view of the thing, because as you can see, it's just a JSON document, nothing special here. It's really straightforward. It just points each other to what to do first, what to do next, and what is the outcome, and nothing else is really like set in here. The only difference is, for example, I could define more triggers here. I could just define a lot more triggers, like 5, to check simultaneously and check different sources for one of the same flows, to just like integrate everything into one and have this one running, for example, on a recurring structure. And as you can see, you have version controls and these kinds of things. And one of the most of the times I would really use them, this is one of the biggest differences here, is you have all of these so-called Azure role-based access control RBAC at your disposal. You can use a system assigned or user assigned managed identity, which is a resource that is given extra rights on the application level to just authenticate through Azure AD away from a user's perspective. So with this one, I can just give role assignments into anything that I want to, for example. And you can see for this one here, in this subscription, you can see, for example, it has a couple of things. It doesn't even need this one, but it has different settings from what my user has. So my user could just use this flow from, for example, PowerAutomate and never be bothered, for example, with authenticating, or it doesn't create problems, for example, if a user is disabled or moved or leaves the company, for example. So this is a whole different level where you can see left to right what you could do more when you use LogicApp. There's, of course, a lot of connectors that are not present in LogicApp that are present in PowerAutomate. But from the perspective of security, you have to say, for example, yes, there's a lot of things. For example, I could control an access control and say, okay, you can only use other logic apps to be triggering this one. Or I could just limit the IP range to my company ones that is defined already. And these kind of things really make sense from this development and security perspective when you want to build complex solutions. So from my perspective, going from LogicApp to PowerAutomate is just a complexity thing, and it works well if you're in an enterprise context and you wish to have the same functionality, you wish to build upon connectors and integrate there and have a distinguishment between like a user's perspective, what they can consume and how, and of course, a logic app. So what's the drawback here? And let's get back to the presentation shortly, because there is, of course, a major catchback. You can't really call an logic app from PowerAutomate because it's just not there. You know, it's not present in as a connector, for example. So you have to call it from an HTTP endpoint. And this one is actually tracked by Microsoft and is considered a custom connector that can be applied easily, but it's a premium one. So you're stuck with a premium again, for example, and you need the license based for this one, for example. So this is where we get us down to thinking like, how could you do that differently? What else is there, for example, to integrate with? As you can see, all of these capabilities in Azure that are not premium, they boil down to custom connectors. And it's the same, for example, if we look at the next alternative to one, which is Azure Functions. I just like try to give a broad overview, for example, how you would use that in the context here. And this one allows, for example, to have both ways here. Actually, you can use a custom connector, which is a standard connector from the Azure function. There's an Azure function URL, for example, which is not considered like an HTTP premium connector. Really interesting. But you could also, of course, use like a normal HTTP endpoint, which is a premium connector as well, for example. So, and functions already is really cool because it allows you to use polling as a method, for example, to overcome certain limitations that we have with PowerAutomate and LogicApps, for example, which is run duration with like 90 respective to 120 seconds in normal modes, for example, and you could just poll that and use a webhook pattern. You can use advanced HTTP methods here, for example, or create your own APIs with this one. So this is where your developers actually from Azure can contribute a lot here, for example. So if you're working on this one, I'm pretty sure you already worked with functions. You know the drill. You know how you could do that. And the idea here is to say it works well, for example, if you want to use that as a custom connector. And yeah, but it has a cold start time. So just to say you're aware, for example, so it might not always work. There's always this 10 to 30 seconds of cold start time that could apply, for example, if it was down over the evening or other things applied, for example, if you didn't set it up that way to always be on. And the difference you can see, for example, when we're looking at a short demo on how it's set up as a custom connector. So again, switching back and forth. So you got this time it's with it's really funny because this is one one thing that was coming to mind actually this morning, and I wanted to share that, for example. So in a different tenant, because there's Ignite coming up in Microsoft space, in one of the demo tenants that I have a new graphic interface that is totally different from the old graphics interface that you have with LogicApps or PowerAutomate. Maybe it's going to be rolled out soon for everyone, but it looks nice. It really looks like tidy. It looks like self-explanatory, for example, and you can see even if it's a complex flow like this one, it's more adjusted to the breadth of it, for example, because in the old way, it just like it was spreading out from left to right and you can't read it on one space. And this time it's really, even in a complex phase, you can see it's really doing a job well in displaying me this one. So for this one, this was, for example, like I was querying LogicApps for Graph API. That's why I called like a couple of HTTPs and set them variables up and created them in a block, for example, and gave a response back to a different program. For example, this was a customer setup that I initially test case here. And you could do that, for example, as well. And you could call this one, for example, from your PowerAutomate perspective as well. It's an HTTP endpoint, and you just need to create a connection here to the HTTP endpoint, and then you can just call it. That works well. So coming back to what I initially wanted to show you, because I was stumbling on this earlier this morning, and it's always the same with cloud, right? We don't look back, we just look ahead. Everything is changing, and there's always things changing, and it makes it very interesting to see, for example, how things develop and everything. And from that perspective, for example, let's have a look at this one here. So if for example, so I can even show you that one, for example. As you can see, this is from a different perspective here, but I have a setup as a custom connector that allows me to use a demo function. As you can see, that's the function endpoint here. And what it does initially is, like, from a definition perspective, the function itself holds different functions in place under app service plan, for example, where I just like call different URIs, as you can see, and use them in a context here. And the same is applicable, for example, for the LogicApp endpoint, which is as well a custom connector here. You can see it's logicApp.com, and it holds a lot of triggers here where I will be. But the difference here is it's per LogicApp. So meaning, like, you can see I could add more, but it's not working here on this way because that's custom connector for LogicApps. What it does actually is quite interesting when you look at, for example, a sample app that we. Sorry, didn't want to do that. Sorry, this one is in German, but it rested with me quite some time. So give me a second, and I can actually show you that the difference from where the connector is created is making a difference, for example, in how it is portrayed in Microsoft. So as you can see, for example, I hope you can read it. The webinar API, which is based on a function, is a standard connector, whereas the LogicApp demo that was planned from one of the flows that you've seen before is actually considered a premium connector. So there's room for improvement, and this is one of the patterns that makes sense, where working together from from a Power Platform perspective, PowerAutomate or PowerApps developer perspective, and of course, for example, working together on working together on Azure components like serverless with functions, with polling rhythms, with event hubs, for example, or LogicApps could make a difference, because there's now nothing hindering you in using those things for your liking. You could even do it yourself, of course. I expect people that are attending here are quite capable of doing that. And you could create a whole new set of business value here. So that was the demo I wanted to show you for this one. And next thing coming up is, of course, today's main focus. And I'm looking at the time. API management, because this is what I wanted to talk to you today about, is how would you extend Power Platform if you want to step up that game once more. Let's say there's a couple of already very well established and working functions. There's a couple of, like, let's say, thought after and looked for templates that you already have in place, be it for ARM templates, where you can, for example, define as code how you want to structure whole infrastructures. For example, let's say you want to have a streaming event, or you want to host a conference with a website and different host service and a database in place, and it's essentially always the same. And you could do it yourself, or you could, people, like, from business perspective, just like have a push button and push it through to Azure, authenticate with your own Azure methods here, have all of the Azure security in place, and you could use API management for that. It's like just wrapping around all of those components into an API management solution, and then using that as a custom connector again, allowing you to just pull through. And this is what we can do, for example, and this is what I want to show you. So in this scenario, for example, you just like use what is already in place. You could use APIs that you have on premise. You have maybe a web service that is already like addressable through REST, for example. You have machine images or like machine performance that you want to expose, and or you just have a couple of logic apps that you would want to trigger backend services, and you could do that and wrap around API management for this one. And so what we're going to set up now is just like I prepared a bit, and let's see how you would, for example, use that one and just like natively integrate it with Power Platform. So, and then you can expose this one in a secure way through Azure. And of course, for example, you could use access policies, and I totally recommend that, for example, for the developers to, of course, define the products, define the policies here, and use fine-grained options, for example, to mask requests, everything that you want to do, for example. Yeah, keep in mind, in order to work with Power Platform, you have to have, let's say, a trust, for example. And I had that issue with the customers. Like, now we don't want to trust. We don't want to give an API key, which is required in a consumption way, to trust both sides, for example. And you could do that, and just that's why I'm mentioning this one. If you go from consumption to, let's say, developer standard or premium, for example, API management, you get to have service principals as well. So you could use, or from Azure AD, you could use token renewal processes and all of the things that allow you to just like really secure those two spaces and tie them together securely, and use whatever in the backend is here. And from this perspective, for example, there's, as you might see, I'm just switching on a laser pointer, for example. So as you can see. So, and now I'm having two laser pointers. I don't know if you can see double as well. So I don't really know which one you're actually seeing. Let's see. Let's start it again. Maybe it works again. Yes, this one. That looks better. And as you can see, so within Azure AD, I draw this line just around, just to say, okay, this is kind of like covered here, and there's a subscription, of course, where everything is hosted, and I just like put in SQLDB, SQL warehouse, for example, as a data warehouse solution, where everything you could connect to. For example, it has its own APIs, it has its own exposure mechanics, for example, where I could like use business logic and logic apps, or just like use it as a server interface, for example, through functions, and wrap everything in API management and expose this as a custom connector. And then I can just consume it on side of the Power Platform. In this case, for example, in PowerApps. So let's switch over again, shall we? So at this time, we'll be looking at this one here. So let's go back there. So this is my API manager, and this just set it up really easy, really super easy. I created like a couple of resources. I have the demo conference API that Microsoft offers, for example, in place. Doesn't really do much, but it's a definition that a queue can use. And there is an old scenario with a post and get trigger, for example, for some hybrid connection scenarios. And there's the logic app, for example, that has a manual invoke. And these things I can really set up really easily. You just have to, if you have your definitions ready, then you can just integrate it really easily through OpenAPI Rail or different already set up processes where you just like select, for example, your logic app. And I could do that. I mean, I just have one and it's already connected, so it's not showing me any results, but I could do that here. And it's straightforward and method work. Essentially, it's two products that is decided to have, for example, and there's two demo keys, for example, that are in place. So it's really simple. And as you can see, there is even a native Power Platform integration that you can have here. And I can create a connector, and that's what we're going to do now. I'll just use the defined APIs that I have here, for example, and say, let's do the demo conference API, for example. It tells me, okay, which kind of like PowerApps I want to put it into. I can only default this one because I'm a different user account in this one. And I have a display name, which will be there. So when I start this process, I just have to, let's say, probably it's something with that one. Might be it's not done that properly. So yeah, that looks better. Let's wait till it's finished. Yep. So, and we should see that one inside the other demo that we've seen earlier. It's just like I have a different user account for both. And of course, I can't use them in the same browser. That's why I have to switch again. Sorry for that one. So going back. So, and going back to custom connectors, and there should be a number 2 available here. As you can see, it's set up the way it is intended to be. And when we look at it, for example, it draws all of the host information in the conference base from API management, is authenticated through API key, which I will provide when we do a connection session here. And as you can see, all of the methods are here, and which query parameters. Come on. And of course, everything is you can see there's an open API and everything. If you need that, for example, you just like copy paste your own definitions over there and it's done. Yeah, it really works well. So from a test perspective, for example, we could create just a new connection here, and for this I need the API key, which I will draw from my different other window, which is the now I have this connection somewhere in place here. There it is, and we can like test this one, for example, and as you can see, I have a test operation, and then just like, let's say, get speakers, for example. It doesn't need anything to work. There's nothing there to get it to work, and it's working, as you can see, and it's getting data. Not much, because this one is really simple. It's just a definition. It just goes over the definition and gives me back to me. But essentially, it's, as you can see, it's working. Yeah. So how would it look like if I would use that one in an app, for example? And I misclicked again. So for this, of course, you're going to add some data, and you're going to use connections like this one, for example. It is. And with that one, for example, I could use a example collections, for example, where I say, okay, get speakers is demo conference API get speakers. Get speakers, I don't know the speaker's name, that's why I'm just leaving it as it is. And the same could I do for demo conference API get sessions, for example. And I suspect it's not going to do a lot. And should be working. But what's the problem with the collections? Not quite sure why it has an error here now, because there's nothing it really expects, but I suspect there's this one missing. This one, these, for example. And if you want to just test it, for example, you're not getting anything back because it just like tells you this is true and gives back to you. Oh, sorry, clicked. And as you can see, I'm just getting a true value back. So that one worked in the sense that it did nothing. But essentially, that would be the idea. For example, how you would like wrap around everything that you've already done in Azure, for example, and everything that is already available. You can use here and different methods to extend beyond the normal capabilities and to build upon everything that is already done on a logic or like on a serverless perspective. Even you could even implement or like circumvent, for example, normal connectors. And if you just like, for example, use a function, for example, like a nested and branching off function that allows you, for example, to just like draw from ARM templates that are rested within your DevOps organization in Azure, for example. And you could integrate this one as well, for example, as like use the news template, and you just like get a couple of machines if that's the use case here. But this is the thing that I wanted to show you in as such today's session. So coming back to my presentation. And it's here. So not yet reacting. So, and that's why I put this one in here, because just to remind you that everything we do here, or we could do, for example, is kind of like always the same, and it's about creating value for either business or customers, for example. So develop, deliver, operate might ring a bell here. It's essentially what we do here is everything is a code-based deployment. Everything I could do, for example, every structure here that we have, we could operate from a DevOps perspective. We could have it in a repository, for example, where you just like integrate this through an API. API management would be the case in this case, where you just like say, okay, I have an endpoint that can be just like adjusted and is exposed to Power Platform and allows business users to use whatever they need. The only thing they would need to know is what is behind, of course, every API, every endpoint that is being used here. So, but from Power users' perspective, you could use this too from an Azure's perspective. If you have access to Azure or you want to play, that's absolutely fine, and it's really recommended to use that one. And when we come to the two perspectives that we started with, for example, like API management, for me, is a relatively straightforward way, an easy and, of course, explainable way how you would use that one to securely expose things that already resist in the cloud and use not so complex method to have the full functionality that is already there in place if you don't or you can't use the standard premium connectors that are already offered with Azure, for example. And there's, of course, a lot of things. You could, for example, even use this to parse data. That's why I built a logic app just for this showcase here, where you just like send in a query, for example. You just would have to define the parameters to have in the query section in that logic app, and everything will be covered. And it's a absolutely secure way, if you set it right, of course, with like managed identities and these kind of things, to integrate with Azure. And you could this is potential to work together. This is something where I say, okay, somebody, of course, has to do it at the end of the day. But this is something that actually would benefit both sides here. So chances could be, for example, like if you develop a LogicApps, for example, or like you're probing together, that it will be leading to even better solutions, of course, for both parties. And that's why I'm really keen on this one. Actually, this kind of view is really tightly connected with another session I'm really fond of, and this is the data ops department. So if you want to talk about this one, I would be happy to get your insights or get your ideas if this is something interesting to you. And because it's same patterns, it's same. It's combining perspectives in an agile and repeatable way. So you don't have to do anything from scratch. You use what is there, for example, and you can use a lot of features that have been maintained and mended by people who've spent maybe hours on developing the architecture and the solution behind it. So, and because I just put it in here, for example, on as a reminder there, it can be expanded with Event Hub, and those perspectives to understand. This is just the way forward from my perspective.